iBasso makes DAPs, IEMs, and portable amps. Their products are generally well made and distinctive. In 2019, iBasso released their first headphones, the SR1. This headphone cost $500 and had a very unique look and was in fact in limited stock. It was reported that only 500 units were ever made. Fast forward 1 year, and iBasso released their second iteration, the SR2. The SR2 is a reimagining of the original headphone. It costs $550, has a more traditional design, and attempts to bring luxury to mid-level hi-fi. If you decide to buy the SR2 or any other hi-fi product, I have a 5% discount code from Audio46. It's in the description section below. Use the referral link to Audio46 in the description section and use the discount code at the checkout. Alternatively, I also have Amazon links. Anyway, is the SR2 a worthwhile headphone or just an experiment you should ignore? iBasso does not have a webpage dedicated to the SR2. This is rather strange, but it is consistent for this company. For some strange reason, iBasso does not have web pages dedicated to each and every one of their products. From what I could determine by looking at reseller websites, the SR2 promises some interesting things. Supposedly, the SR2 is a high-quality audiophile monitor, whatever that's supposed to mean. It uses biocellulose drivers, something that Denon is chiefly known for. The SR2 promises to retrieve the full scope of the music with all the micro details intact. The SR2 allegedly provides a natural and realistic portrayal of the recording. According to Bloom Audio's description, the SR2 has an analytical tuning. I see a bit of contradiction in the marketing. On the one hand, the SR2 is supposed to provide a natural and realistic sound, but on the other hand, it's supposed to be analytical. In my view, these things are not the same. I suppose we'll have to figure out what's accurate and what's not. The SR2 is a fairly large headphone, but surprisingly, it is also fairly light. The ear cups are metal, the yoke is metal, and the headband structure is two thin pieces of metal. The headband itself is leather. It feels supple and has some thickness, which adds a little bit of padding. The earpads are large, soft, and premium. The SR2 comes with 2 sets of perforated leather earpads, by the way, and the earpads are angled. The headphone comes in a sturdy yet large protective case. Inside, you'll find a premium 3.5mm cable. This cable is pliable and transmits little microphonics. While the headphone is not flimsy, it is also not exactly robust. The principal issue is the headband. The 2 thin pieces of metal do not provide sufficient rigidity. The ear cups wobble at the yoke. I've had these headphones for several months and have not noticed cracks or indications that the yokes may snap, but I still recommend being gentle with the SR2 nonetheless. As for comfort, the SR2 is a fairly comfortable headphone. Its lightweight is evenly distributed across the headband. The lack of padding means I do feel some pressure at the top of my head, and after a few hours, I need to readjust the headphone. The clamping force is about average. The earpads are thick and sit completely around my ears. However, the top of my ears do get a little bent and pinched. I can easily wear the SR2 for 3 hours without discomfort. The earpads are surprisingly comfortable. Stock earpads are generally hit or miss. I can count on one hand the number of times I found a stock earpad on a headphone to be sublimely comfortable. Now, the SR2 does not fit the sublime category for me, but it is better than average. Overall, the build is modern, unpretentious, and frankly, simple. While I would have preferred a more rigid headband, what iBasso did here clearly was intended to save weight. I don't necessarily agree with their decision, but it seems to work fine. If there's one thing I could complain about, it's the lack of a balanced cable. Balanced is not necessary for this headphone, but it just seems missing when the rest of the package is considered. The accessories are top-notch. This is yet more proof that big-name brands could, if they wanted to, provide more and better accessories in the box. Take audeze, for example. While their large LCD headphones cost at least $200 to $300 more than the SR2, audeze does not provide a cable that is remotely as high-end as the one in the SR2's box. And audeze could learn a few things about throwing in spare earpads for their $1,000 plus headphones, considering products that cost half that amount do it. As far as I'm concerned, iBasso did not hold any punches with the SR2. The design, construction, and accessories are in fact consistent with premium hi-fi gear and should give the hype companies a few things to think about. To test the SR2 sound signature, I paired it with several devices. I used it with my RME ADI2 DAC, my Matrix Mini-I Pro 3, my Mytek Brooklyn DAC Plus, Shitmodi and Liquid Spark stack, and the iBasso DX160, both the 2019 and the 2020 versions. I used the stock earpads and cable. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I will emphasize that the SR2 is very easy to power. These drivers are quite sensitive and you should have no trouble getting the SR2 quite loud using most sources. However, my test suggests that the SR2 will benefit from an amplifier for peak performance. The sound tends to be a bit clearer, slightly more detailed with a proper amp than with headphone output from your computer or mobile device. iBasso says nothing about the bass performance of the SR2. My tests indicate that there is a sub-bass roll-off, but overall clear bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a low rumble from the beginning of the track. The SR2 resolved that detail, but it was a little faint. I had to crank up the volume beyond safe levels to finally start hearing the sub-bass. Even then, it was obvious that there was a roll-off. Transients was fairly quick, but not as fast as planar magnetic drivers. However, the transients was faster than typical dynamic drivers I've heard. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the song, the organ sliced through the other instruments and stood ahead of them. There was excellent separation among instruments without any muffling or veiled sound. The rolling thunder effect was audible but somewhat subdued. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were just shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble effect at the beginning. This sound is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The SR2 recreated this detail perfectly. The panning was clear and consistent. There are multiple drums on this track, and the SR2 presented all of them without difficulty. Each drum strike was hard and precise. There was marginal melding between each drum strike. The synth was a bit elevated, louder than the drums, but not harsh. I listened to several hip-hop songs including New Patek, Reel It In, Uproar, and Pure Water. On each occasion, it was obvious that the SR2 did not fully present the sub-bass. The subwoofer sounded like it was at the other end of a very large room. Another way to describe it is this. Imagine Gucci Mane rolls up in his pimped-out Escalade with aftermarket dual subwoofers in the trunk, parks that Escalade down the block, and plays his greatest hits. You will hear it, and it'll remind you of a subwoofer, but you'll probably enjoy it a lot more if you were inside Gucci Mane's Escalade. Know what I mean? Gucci Mane. Anyway, the drums were clearer and closer to neutral. There was good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, resulting in at least better than average clarity. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. I played the Sicario soundtrack and tested for audible sub-bass distortion. This was among the clearest and cleanest presentations of the Sicario soundtrack I have heard thus far on headphones. I pushed the headphones to well beyond safe listening volumes close to ear-piercing and could not hear any distortion. I listened to Irodori by the Japanese drum band Kodo and Bim Bam Smash from the Bourne Supremacy soundtrack. Both songs use different types of drums that have different decay and tonalities. The SR2 clearly presented every drum with minimal melding. In Bim Bam Smash, there is a pause at 1 minute and 15 seconds and a hard drum strike. The SR2 perfectly recreated this detail. It was clear, impactful, but not elevated or bloated. Overall, the SR2 presents an interesting bass response. The sub-bass is clearly rolled off. It is not anemic, but it is also not typical dynamic driver performance. I think most planar magnetic headphones have a bit more roll-off. Mid-bass seems to be very close to neutral. There is good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. This separation is not to the same degree as on the Austrian Audio Hi X55 and X65, but easily above average nonetheless. The SR2's mids are forward, clear, and sibilant. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, natural vocal grain and sibilance are recorded into the track. The SR2 emphasized both. The vocal grain was more neutral on the Aventone Planar and the Allo S4X when I compared them to the SR2. The sibilance was also neutral on the Planar, while the SR2 pushed it forward, very similar to what the Allo S4X does. The SR2's sibilance emphasis is well below that of the HD560S, by the way. Orlo's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The drums and guitar were clear, separate, and had correct timbre. In Want You Back by Haim, the SR2 again accentuated the sibilance in the primary vocalist's voice. It wasn't harsh or piercing, but clearly elevated compared to the Avantone planar. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The SR2 perfectly recreated this detail as well. There are 2 backup vocalists in this track, and the SR2 initially presented their voices separate from each other, one in the right ear cup while the other was in the left. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded a little, but with close attention, I could just pick them apart. The guitar, piano, bass, and drums all had correct timbre. Their notes marginally melded. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the SR2 correctly recreated the ukulele and drums. The bass was a little distant. I could hear the slight perturbations of the ukulele, a detail that a vast majority of headphones I have tested cannot resolve. The primary male vocalist was clear, and his voice was easily 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His sibilance was marginally elevated, not quite as much as with female artists. There's a backup singer whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. I could just barely hear that other voice on the SR2. Frankly, most headphones can't even do that much. There are sharp intakes of breath between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds. The SR2 recreated this detail without any trouble. Overall, the SR2 presents forward mids. Vocals are pushed ahead of instruments. Sibilance is audible on both male and female vocals, assuming that was allowed into the original recording. The mids are clear, instruments have correct timbre, and there's not a hint of veiled or muffled sound. Vocals tend to be close to the ears. The SR2 elevates treble just a little, but this frequency range is clear and precise. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the SR2 presented the brass and horns with additional energy than what I heard on the Avantone planar and even the Allo S4X. The SR2 was not harsh or fatiguing, however. The timpani seemed to be underemphasized. There was good separation among group sets, but I could not hear individual instruments. The SR2 does provide depth, but not a whole lot of verticality. I could easily hear instruments placed closer and further away. In Flight from the City, the SR2 made the piano appear like it was 5 feet away. The bassy notes were underemphasized but clear. The notes barely melded with each other. The cello was smooth and also was fairly separate from the piano. I could easily hear the pops and sizzles and the electric buzzing effects that are recorded into the bottom layer of this track. I could also hear, without any difficulty, the creaking of wood and the shifting of the cello. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the SR2 presented the piano in the right, the drums in the left, the saxophone dead center, and the bass further in the back. The saxophone appeared to have a bit more energy on the SR2 than what I heard with the Avantone planar and the S4X. However, the saxophone was not harsh or piercing. All instruments were clear and separate from each other. I could easily hear the different sounds as the cymbals were struck at different positions. This detail seemed to be a little pushed forward, more forward than what I heard on the S4X and the Avantone planar, but it did not overshadow the saxophone. Overall, the treble is clear but a little elevated. It is not neutral, that much I am certain. The SR2's treble response is slightly more emphasized than the Allo S4X's. The SR2 provides good clarity, separation, placement, and detail in this region. I have no doubt that the SR2 provides more detail and clarity than most headphones that I've heard. It is clearer than a lot of planar magnetic headphones I've heard, clearer than a lot of dynamic drivers, and had no difficulty resolving nuances in all the tracks I tested. However, the SR2 is not the king of detail. This is not the HD800S. Multiple vocalists, pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, creaking of wood, sharp intakes of breaths, perturbations in string instruments, and layered details are not difficult to hear on this headphone. The SR2 will present obvious details and a lot of subtle ones too. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps, the Focal Clear, 18 footsteps, the Austrian Audio Hi-X 65, 16 to 17 footsteps, The Austrian Audio HiX55 presents 16 footsteps. The hifi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, and Biodynamic DT1990 all present 10 to 11 footsteps. The audeze LCD2 Closed and the LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8 footsteps. The monolith M1070 and M1570 provide between 8 to 9, and the older M1060C provides about 7. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6. The Sifka P2 presents 10 to 11 footsteps. The SR2 presented 12 to 13 footsteps. In my tests, I used the HD6XX as the average performer. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. With this in mind, it is easy for me to conclude that the SR2 has above average detail. In fact, the SR2's detail retrieval rivals that of the hifi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, and the Sifka P2. However, the SR2 does not provide as much detail and clarity as the Austrian Audio headphones. I judge Soundstage similar to how I judge detail retrieval. The HD6XX is my average performer. Since a lot of people have this headphone, they can probably relate. I will describe the SR2's Soundstage performance on the following scale. The audeze Mobius and All Beats headphones barfed up by the music industry have claustrophobic soundstage. The Neumann NDH20 and Audio-Technica ATH M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and audeze LCD1, obviously, have average soundstage. The hifi Mansundara, Avantone Planar, Sifka P2, Austrian Audio HiX55 and X65 all have above average soundstage. The hifi Mandiva has wide soundstage. And the Sennheiser HD800S has super wide soundstage. I would put the SR2 along with the Sundara, Avantone Planar, and the others in the above average rung. I think the SR2 is about as wide as the Avantone Planar and the X65, but the Sundara has just a tiny bit more soundstage. Moreover, the SR2 does have depth but no verticality, or not really a whole lot. Instruments, if recorded and mastered to reflect this, will appear closer or further away depending on the track, but up and down movement is usually not perceptible. Some of the SR2's marketing says that it is an analytical headphone, but others say it provides natural sound. In my mind, there is a difference. While natural sound can be detailed, it is not analytical. The SR2 appears to be a unique amalgam of natural and analytical. In truth, I don't think it's strictly either. The SR2's sub-bass has a noticeable roll-off. It is not as significant as with most planar magnetic headphones I've heard, but it is obviously rolled off compared to typical dynamic drivers. Mid-bass appears to be close to neutral. There is good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, resulting in above-average clarity in this region. There is no audible distortion whatsoever. The mids are forward. Vocals, both male and female, are sibilant. While not harsh, it is a clear deviation from neutral tuning. Instruments have correct timbre. They are also clear and separate in a group. There is minimal melding among elements in a given track. Vocals are 2 steps ahead of instruments and appear to be a bit intimate, close to the ears. Treble is elevated. It is not neutral, but it is also not piercing or harsh. Treble instruments are energetic, clear, and separate. Nothing ever sounds out of place or distracting. However, if you are sensitive to treble, then the SR2 will not do you any favors. The SR2 has above-average detail and soundstage. Its clarity is fairly unique in the pantheon of headphones, both below and above its price range. However, the SR2 is not alone in the clarity department, and indeed, other options near its price surpass the SR2 in that regard. In a sense, the SR2 is analytical. It does provide more detail, clarity, and separation that you might hear on a lot of headphones. On the other hand, the SR2 does not shove details into your ears, nor does it make recording sound particularly harsh. This is a pretty weird position. I cannot say one way or another what the SR2 sound signature is. It's kind of a hybrid. If you want more than average detail, clarity, placement, and resolution, but you also want intimate vocals and natural timbre, then the SR2 might be your cup of tea. But if you are at all sensitive to sibilants or treble, or if you want a warm or neutral sound signature, then the SR2 is unlikely to make you happy. I think it is imperative that we compare products as often as possible. That's the only way to truly know how a product performs, other than to try it yourself, and whether it is worth spending your money on it. To that end, we will compare a few headphones to the SR2. There's really no rhyme or reason, since the SR2 sound signature is fairly different from a lot of headphones I've heard. I decided to compare the SR2 against the hi-fi man Sundara, the audeze LCD2 Classic, the Beyerdynamic DT1990, and the Austrian Audio Hi-X65. I use the stock earpads and cables on each of these headphones. I use my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I plug the headphones into my passive AB switch, which was itself connected to my RME ADI2 DAC. I also use my Sterling SHA4 connected to the Soundcause LAQXD1. I volume matched to the best of my ability. I've already thoroughly reviewed and compared all of these headphones in the past. Here, we will only discuss generally how they compare to the SR2. The Sundara has a slightly greater sub-bass roll-off than the SR2. Transience is a bit faster on the Sundara as well. Bass clarity, however, is about the same on both headphones. Mid-bass impact seems to be just a bit sharper on the SR2, but that could also be attributed to imperfect volume matching. Separation of mid-bass from sub-bass is very similar, but I would say that the Sundara has slightly more of it. The mids do sound different on these headphones. Both headphones accentuate vocal grain and sibilance. However, the Sundara sibilance is noticeably less and closer to neutral. Vocals are closer to the ears on the SR2 and sound more full. The Sundara's vocals sound a little distant in comparison. The timbre of instruments was the same, but decay was a bit faster on the Sundara. Separation among instruments was marginally greater on the Sundara as well. Treble is also different. The Sundara is closer to neutral while the SR2 accentuates treble instruments. Moreover, the SR2 makes instruments appear closer to the ears while the Sundara pushes them further back. Treble clarity is fairly close among these headphones, and I don't think one really has more than the other in this region. The SR2 has as much detail as the Sundara, and maybe a little bit more. However, the Sundara has slightly wider soundstage. The LCD2 Classic has a greater sub-bass roll-off than the SR2. Now, the Classic has a bit more sub-bass than the Sundara, but not by a whole lot. The SR2 has more bass clarity than the Classic. There is greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass on the SR2. Mid-bass impact is very similar, but I think the SR2 has sharper drum strikes. Transience is a little bit faster on the Classic. The mids are dissimilar. The Classic and the SR2 both accentuate vocal grain and sibilance. The Classic has a greater emphasis of both, although marginally. Both headphones present vocals close to the ears. Separation of mid-centric instruments is clearer on the SR2. Timbre is the same on both headphones. Treble sounds similar on these headphones. Both headphones accentuate this frequency, and I had a hard time telling the difference. The SR2 has a bit more treble clarity and more separation of instruments. Both headphones present treble-centric instruments closer to the ears. The Classic is not as clear as the SR2 and does not provide much detail as the SR2. Soundstage is similar, but I think that the Classic has just a little bit more of it. The DT1990 has a slightly greater sub-bass roll-off than the SR2. Transience is about the same. Clarity is noticeably greater on the SR2. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is a close call, but I think that the SR2 has a bit more of it. Mid-bass slam is harder and sharper on the 1990, but not by much. The mids are somewhat similar, but there are a few distinct differences. Both headphones accentuate vocal grain and sibilance. The SR2 has a greater emphasis on the grain than the 1990, but the 1990 has a noticeably greater emphasis on sibilance than the SR2. Sibilance on the 1990 is sharper and sometimes harsh depending on the track. Both headphones present vocals close to the ears, but the SR2 pushes vocals at least one step further ahead of instruments than the 1990. Timbre is the same on both headphones. Clarity is a bit greater on the SR2. Treble is similar on these headphones. Both accentuate this region and seem to do it fairly evenly. But at higher volumes, the 1990 did have more sharpness. The treble clarity is about the same as is instrument separation. However, the SR2 provides more depth than the 1990. Timbre is the same. The SR2 has a bit more detailed retrieval than the 1990. and it also has slightly wider soundstage than the 1990, but not really by a whole lot. The X65 has less sub-bass presence than the SR2. However, bass clarity is noticeably greater on the X65. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is marginally more obvious on the X65. Mid-bass impact is slightly harder and sharper on the X65. The X65 and SR2 both accentuate sibilance and vocal grain. However, the X65 has smoother vocal grain but a bit more sibilance than the SR2. Both headphones present vocals 2 steps ahead of instruments. Separation among elements in a mix is clearer on the X65. Timbre is the same. Both the X65 and the SR2 emphasize the treble. I think it's a close call which one does treble push more, and honestly, I can't tell. Separation of treble instruments is greater on the X65, however. The SR2 presents instruments closer to the ears, while the X65 pushes them further back, giving more room. Both headphones have about the same amount of depth, but the X65 definitely has more verticality. The X65 has greater detail retrieval, slightly greater clarity, and generally more instrument separation compared to the SR2. Soundstage is also marginally wider on the X65. What have we learned from these comparisons? Well, first of all of these headphones have different sound signatures. There are similarities, of course, but none perform or sound identical to any other. Second, the SR2 in these comparisons does exhibit greater sub-bass presence. However, when compared to the Allo Audio S4X and typical close-back headphones, the SR2 does have a noticeable roll-off. Third, the SR2 sound signature is most similar to that of the DT1990, but again, they aren't the same. The 1990 has its own issues, particularly the aggressive sibilance and greater sub-bass roll-off than the SR2. The DT1990 also sometimes exhibits sub-bass distortion in my uber bass tests, while the SR2 never has. Regardless, the point is that the SR2 is a different headphone. I don't think it will suit anybody who is looking for a smooth, relaxing signature. It's not neutral, but neither is it aggressively analytical. It's in a weird middle ground somewhere between neutral and analytical. It's truly neither, yet constructively both. Yes, this does not make sense, but that's the joy of finding a headphone that does things differently. As always, you may utterly hate all of these headphones, like one or all of them, or be completely unmoved and continue to live your life happily without them. There are a lot of good headphones on the market. I do not believe in endgame gear because I don't think that's true. It's only endgame until it isn't. And anybody who says that they've achieved endgame status will, I think, eventually start thinking about something new. It's only a matter of time. So instead of focusing on what other people say is their endgame, I prefer to talk about performance and sound signature. You really need to know what you like, and just as valuable is knowing what you do not like. You may be willing to take a chance on a fairly cheap headphone like the Blonde BL30 and accept the financial loss. But when you start spending hundreds of dollars, losing money on a subpar product becomes less excusable. The SR2 is far from a subpar product. There's nothing subpar about it. While I have some reservations about its headband structure, there is nothing else I can think of that would make me want to caution people against buying it. This brings us to value. At $550, the SR2 is competing in an ever more crowded market. But I do think it is value. The funny thing is that I keep finding headphones that I conclude do have value but are priced at their extreme limit. I'm not quite sure that the SR2 really falls into that category for a number of reasons. When I think of value, I take a lot of things into consideration. This includes the build, accessories, company profile, warranty, and overall performance. When I speak of performance, I'm not talking about sound signature. Instead, I refer to specific classifications such as soundstage, detail retrieval, clarity, separation, and placement. Yes, all of these things contribute to the sound signature, but individually they are less abstract and somewhat quantifiable. The SR2 is a luxury headphone. It is packaged as one. It is accessorized as one. The SR2 is built well. It is simplistic yet different. It comes with a luxury cable, a spare set of comfortable earbuds, and a sturdy case. There's nothing proprietary about the earpads or cable, which means that you have the freedom to swap them out at your leisure. It amazes me how regularly big-name manufacturers refuse to include quality cables and spare earpads with their pricey headphones. Take Audeze, ZMF, Monolith, Denon, and Sennheiser as examples. Why is it so hard for these guys to throw in a spare set of earpads for the consumer, especially when their end-of-the-line headphones cost well over $1,000? So, whenever a manufacturer provides decent cables and spare accessories, they make themselves stand out from the group, with minimal cost to their bottom line. With respect to performance, the SR2 does not stomp on every headphone on the market, but it does run with a good pack. The SR2 Soundstage is above average. Its detail retrieval is easily above average, as is its clarity and separation. Instrument placement is some of the best I've heard, though there is not much verticality, if any. But the SR2 is not the king of the hill in any of these categories. It does not come close to the HD800S or even the hifi Mandiva in Soundstage. The Austrian Audio Hi X55 and X65 still have greater detail, separation, and placement. If we were talking about a true analytical headphone, then I would say that the SR2 is outperformed by cheaper alternatives. And if we were talking about a true neutral or natural headphone, then I'd say the same thing. The SR2 is outperformed by cheaper options. But the SR2 is an interesting hybrid. It does have qualities of both broad classifications. It has impactful yet not piercing bass. It has intimate vocals with instruments that have correct timbre. It emphasizes treble but never harshly. You get more detail, soundstage placement, and separation than with typical neutral or natural sounding headphones. On the other hand, the SR2 is not a detailed surgeon. What I can say with some confidence is that the SR2 will give you a different sound than you're probably used to. If you are not sensitive to sibilance and treble, and you are not a bass head, then the SR2 may be worth a close look. I'm glad to say that the SR2 adds to my collection. While it may not be the right answer for others, it might be a perfectly enjoyable headphone for those who are looking for a luxury product with an engaging sound.